If you think money can't buy respect, wait until you see what happens when a billionaire's daughter pretends to be a cleaner for 3 years, only to reveal her true identity in the most shocking way possible. But before we dive into this incredible tale that's about to unfold, make sure you smash that like button, hit subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful story of transformation and triumph. Grace Adebayo is a 28-year-old woman whose callous hands told stories of hard labor, whose faded uniform spoke of humble beginnings, and whose quiet demeanor suggested a life of simple service. Every morning at 5 a.m., Grace would arrive at the prestigious Golden Tower Corporation, armed with mops, cleaning supplies, and the kind of invisibility that comes with being society's forgotten. She moved through marble hallways like a ghost, cleaning the offices of powerful executives who never bothered to learn her name. To them, she was just another face in the crowd of service workers, someone to ignore, someone beneath their notice, someone whose very presence reminded them of their own superiority. They would discuss million-dollar deals over her head as she emptied their trash bins, never imagining that this humble cleaner understood every word of their business strategies, every nuance of their corporate maneuvers. But Grace Adebayo harbored a secret so explosive that it would shake the very foundations of Lagos high society to its core. She was not just any cleaner. She was the hidden daughter of Chief Samuel Adebayo, the legendary billionaire founder of Royal Crown Industries, one of Nigeria's most powerful business conglomerates. Her father's empire sprawled across construction, telecommunications, oil, and real estate, employing over 50,000 people and generating billions in revenue annually. The story of Grace's hidden identity began 28 years earlier, when Chief Adebayo was a young entrepreneur building his empire. He had fallen deeply in love with a beautiful but simple village girl named Patience, who became pregnant with Grace. However, societal pressures and family expectations forced him to marry someone from his own social class, leaving Patience to raise their daughter alone in obscurity. Chief Adebayo provided financial support from the shadows, but respected Grace's mother's wish to raise their child away from the corrupting influence of extreme wealth. When Patience died in a car accident when Grace was 16, Chief Adebayo wanted to bring his daughter home, but Grace herself refused. She had grown up watching how money corrupted people, how wealth created barriers between human hearts, and she wanted to prove that she could make her own way in the world. So she worked as a waitress, a shop assistant, a house cleaner, always refusing her father's attempts to make her life easier, always insisting on carving her own path through life's challenges. This independent spirit was what attracted David Okafor to Grace 3 years earlier. David, the 29-year-old heir to Okafor Holdings, one of Lagos's most established construction and real estate companies, first met Grace at a small cafe where she was working as a server. She was different from the sophisticated, materialistic women in his social circle. Grace was genuine, kind, and refreshingly honest. She laughed at his jokes not because of his money, but because she genuinely found him funny. She listened to his dreams and fears with real interest, not calculating interest. Their courtship was like something from a romantic movie. David would pick her up after her shifts, and they would walk along Lagos beaches, talking for hours about everything and nothing. He loved how she saw the world through uncynical eyes, how she found joy in simple things like street food and sunset walks. When he proposed to her after 8 months of dating, it was with a simple ring and heartfelt words about wanting to build a life based on love, not convenience. Grace, he had said that magical evening, you make me want to be a better man. Not a richer man or a more powerful man, but a better human being. Will you marry me? Through tears of joy, Grace had whispered yes, believing with her whole heart that love truly could conquer all obstacles. The wedding was small but beautiful, held in a modest church with Grace's few friends and David's immediate family in attendance. Mrs. Victoria Okafor, David's mother, had initially opposed the marriage with barely concealed disdain, but David had stood firm, insisting that Grace was the woman he loved and wanted to spend his life with. During the ceremony, as Grace walked down the aisle in a simple but elegant dress, David's eyes filled with tears of happiness. They looked like the perfect couple, love conquering social barriers, hearts triumphing over material considerations. But fairy tales don't prepare you for the harsh realities of life, and Grace was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. The change in David began almost immediately after their honeymoon. The warm, attentive man who had courted her with such devotion gradually became cold and distant. Phone calls that once lasted hours became brief, businesslike exchanges. Date nights disappeared entirely, replaced by David's increasing involvement in his family's business and social obligations. When Grace would try to discuss their growing distance, David would dismiss her concerns with phrases like "you wouldn't understand" or "business is complicated." The real poison in their marriage, however, came from two sources that would ultimately destroy everything Grace held dear. First was Mrs. Victoria Okafor, David's mother, a woman whose entire identity was built around social status and family reputation. She had never accepted Grace as a suitable wife for her son, viewing her as a temporary embarrassment that would eventually be corrected. Mrs. Okafor was a master manipulator, skilled at planting seeds of doubt in her son's mind with seemingly innocent comments. "David, darling," she would say during family dinners, "Grace seems so quiet lately. Perhaps she's not comfortable in our social circles. It must be difficult for someone from her background to fit in with our kind of people." Or during business discussions, "If only you had married someone who could help advance your career, someone with the right connections and breeding. But I suppose we must make the best of our choices." These constant undermining comments, delivered with a sweet smile and motherly concern, gradually eroded David's confidence in his marriage. Mrs. Okafor was careful never to attack Grace directly in front of David, but her message was clear. Grace was beneath them, a mistake that was holding the family back. The second source of poison was even more dangerous. Blessing Wosu, David's childhood friend who had harbored romantic feelings for him since they were teenagers. Blessing was everything Grace was not: sophisticated, well-connected, from a wealthy family, and utterly ruthless in her pursuit of what she wanted. She had been devastated when David married Grace instead of her, but she didn't give up. Instead, she launched a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy their marriage from within. Blessing made herself indispensable to David's business life, positioning herself as his unofficial advisor and constant companion at social events. She had a master's degree in psychology and used every manipulation technique in the book to undermine David's relationship with Grace while presenting herself as the perfect alternative. "Poor Grace," Blessing would say with fake sympathy. "She just doesn't understand our world, does she? Look how uncomfortable she looks at these business functions. It must be so difficult for her, not knowing how to contribute to conversations about art, or politics, or international business. You're so patient with her, David." Blessing's strategy was brilliant in its subtlety. She never directly criticized Grace. Instead, she would praise David for being understanding and patient with his wife's limitations, gradually convincing him that he was settling for less than he deserved. She would arrange business dinners and social events where Grace would feel out of place, then comfort David afterward about how awkward the situation had been. Meanwhile, Blessing made sure Grace knew exactly where she stood. During the rare occasions when Grace attended social functions, Blessing would make cutting remarks disguised as friendly conversation. "Oh, Grace, what an interesting dress. So practical," Blessing would say with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I love how you don't worry about keeping up with fashion trends. It must be so freeing to not care about appearances." Or, "David was just telling me about his plans to expand into international markets. It's so wonderful that he has someone to discuss these complex business strategies with. Of course, I'm sure you support him in your own way." These interactions left Grace feeling increasingly isolated and inadequate. She began to withdraw from social situations, which only reinforced the narrative that she didn't belong in David's world. David, influenced by months of subtle manipulation from both his mother and Blessing, began to see Grace's withdrawal as evidence of her inability to be the partner he needed. The final transformation in their relationship occurred when David's business faced its first major crisis. A large construction project had run into legal problems, threatening to bankrupt the company if not handled correctly. During this stressful period, David relied heavily on Blessing's advice and support, while Grace, who had no knowledge of business law, could only offer emotional support and encouragement. "She just doesn't understand the pressure I'm under," David confided to Blessing one evening after a particularly difficult day. "When I try to explain what's happening, she just says everything will be okay." She doesn't realize that positive thinking doesn't solve legal problems. Blessing seized the opportunity. You need a partner who can truly support you, David. Someone who understands your world and can contribute meaningfully to your success. You deserve that. It was during this period of crisis and emotional manipulation that Grace made a discovery that should have been the most joyful moment of her life. She was pregnant. After 3 years of marriage filled with increasing loneliness and doubt, this child represented hope for renewal, a chance to rebuild the love that seemed to be slipping away. Grace planned the revelation carefully. She prepared David's favorite meal, set candles around their dining room, and wore the dress he had bought her for their first anniversary, back when he still noticed such things. When he came home that evening, looking exhausted and preoccupied with business concerns, Grace's heart was beating so fast she thought he might hear it. David, she said softly, taking his hands in hers, I have something wonderful to tell you. Something that's going to change our lives in the most beautiful way. David looked at her with mild interest, his mind still clearly on business problems. What is it, Grace? I'm pregnant, she whispered, her voice filled with all the love and hope she had been carrying. We're going to have a baby. The silence that followed was not the joyful explosion she had imagined. Instead, David's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, confusion, and then something that made Grace's blood run cold, anger. Pregnant. David's voice was flat, emotionless. How did this happen? Grace stared at him in disbelief. How did it happen? David, we're married. We're husband and wife. This is supposed to be a blessing. But David was already pulling away, both physically and emotionally. The months of manipulation had done their work too well. Instead of seeing this pregnancy as a gift, he saw it as a trap, a complication that would further tie him to a marriage he had been convinced was a mistake. This is the worst possible timing, David said, running his hands through his hair. The business is in crisis. I'm working 16-hour days, and now this? Grace, I can't handle this right now. The hurt in Grace's eyes should have stopped him, should have reminded him of the man he used to be, the man who had promised to love her through all of life's challenges. But the David who had made those promises was gone, replaced by someone who saw his wife as an obstacle to overcome rather than a partner to cherish. The conversation that should have been a celebration became an argument, and that argument became the beginning of the end. Over the following days, instead of drawing closer in anticipation of their child, David became even more distant. He spent longer hours at the office, came home later, and when he was home, he treated Grace with a cold politeness that was somehow worse than open hostility. Mrs. Okafor's reaction to the pregnancy news was even more devastating. When David told his mother, her face twisted with undisguised disgust. A baby, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Now, when the business needs all of David's attention. How perfectly convenient for Grace. I suppose she thinks this will secure her position in the family. Blessing's response was more subtle but equally poisonous. She expressed congratulations with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, then immediately began planting seeds of doubt about Grace's motives. It's interesting timing, she mentioned casually to David during one of their business meetings. Just when things were getting difficult between you two. Suddenly there's a pregnancy. Some women think a baby will fix their marriage problems, but of course, children only magnify existing issues. These comments, combined with the stress of his business problems and years of subtle manipulation, finally pushed David over the edge. He began to see Grace's pregnancy not as a blessing, but as a manipulation, a desperate attempt to save a marriage that he now believed was fundamentally flawed. The confrontation that would shatter Grace's world came on a rainy Tuesday evening in November. David had been working late again, or so he claimed, and came home to find Grace waiting for him with dinner prepared. She had been feeling nauseated all day due to morning sickness, but she had forced herself to cook his favorite meal, hoping to create a moment of connection between them. David, she said gently as he walked through the door, can we talk? I've been thinking about names for the baby, and I wanted to. Stop, David interrupted, his voice harsh and cold. Just stop with this fantasy, Grace. I can't do this anymore. Grace felt her heart sink, but she tried to maintain hope. Can't do what? David, I know you're stressed about work, but we can get through this together. Our baby. Our baby. David's laugh was bitter and cruel. You think trapping me with a baby is going to save this marriage? You think I don't see what you're doing? The words hit Grace like physical blows. Trapping you? David, this is our child. Our family. But David was beyond reason now, months of manipulation and resentment pouring out in a torrent of hurtful words. Family? Grace, look around you. Look at your life. Look at mine. We don't belong together. We never did. I was young and stupid, mistaking infatuation for love, but I can't pretend anymore. Grace stared at her husband, the man who had once promised to love her forever, who had looked into her eyes and sworn to protect her heart, and saw a stranger. David, please, remember who we used to be. Remember how happy we were. Happy. David's voice was getting louder, and Grace realized with growing horror that this conversation was taking place in the main living room, where his mother and Blessing, who had been visiting for dinner, could hear every word. Grace, I haven't been happy in this marriage for over a year. You don't fit into my world. You don't understand my life. And now you want to bring a child into this mess. Mrs. Okafor appeared in the doorway with Blessing beside her, both women wearing expressions of false concern that barely masked their satisfaction at witnessing Grace's humiliation. David, darling, Mrs. Okafor said in her sweetest voice, perhaps you should lower your voice. Though I must say, it's probably better that these issues are finally being addressed openly. Blessing nodded sympathetically. Grace, honey, perhaps David is right. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes two people are just incompatible. The final blow came when David looked directly at Grace, his eyes cold and unforgiving, and spoke the words that would haunt her forever. I want a divorce, Grace. I want you out of my house, out of my life. Pack your things and leave. Tonight. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace felt as if the world had stopped spinning, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. She looked at David's face, searching for any trace of the man who had once loved her, but found only cold determination. David, she whispered, one hand instinctively moving to protect her still flat stomach. What about our baby? That's your problem now, David replied with a cruelty that took her breath away. You can figure out what to do about it. Mrs. Okafor stepped forward with mock sympathy. Grace, dear, surely you can see that this is for the best. David needs a wife who can support his ambitions, someone from his own background. You've had 3 years to adapt to our lifestyle, and frankly, it just hasn't worked out. Blessing added her own poison to the wound. We've all been walking on eggshells, trying to make you feel included, but you've never really fit in, have you? Perhaps it's time to stop forcing something that was never meant to be. Grace looked around the room, at the husband who was discarding her like trash, at the mother-in-law who had never accepted her, at the woman who had systematically destroyed her marriage, and felt something inside her break. Not just her heart, but her spirit, her sense of self-worth, everything she had built her identity around for the past 3 years. I need time to pack, Grace said quietly, her voice barely audible. You have until tomorrow morning, David replied, not even looking at her. I'll be staying at the office tonight. When I come back, I want you gone. That night, Grace packed her few belongings into 2 small suitcases. Everything she owned in the world, clothes, a few books, some cheap jewelry, fit easily into 2 bags. As she folded each item, she remembered when she had bought it, where she had worn it, what hopes and dreams she had attached to it. The dress she wore on their first date, the necklace he gave her for their first Christmas, the photo from their wedding day, where they looked so young and hopeful and in love. She left the photo on the dresser. Some memories were too painful to carry. As Grace walked out of the house she had called home for 3 years, carrying her suitcases and her broken heart, she didn't notice the black sedan parked across the street. Inside, Chief Samuel Adebayo sat with tears in his eyes, having witnessed his daughter's humiliation through private investigators who had been monitoring her safety. He had respected her independence for years, but watching her be destroyed by people who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as her was more than he could bear. The stress and emotional trauma of that terrible night proved too much for Grace's body to handle. She had walked for hours through Lagos streets, not knowing where to go, not having enough money for a hotel, too proud to call the few friends she had maintained despite David's subtle discouragement of her outside relationships. Finally, exhaustion and grief overcame her, and she collapsed on a bench outside a hospital. The physical and emotional shock caused her to miscarry that same night. Grace lost the baby she had loved so desperately, the child who had represented hope for healing her broken marriage. She lay in a sterile hospital bed, alone and bleeding, having lost everything that mattered to her in the span of 24 hours. It was there that Chief Samuel Adebayo finally broke his promise to let his daughter live independently. He couldn't watch her suffer anymore. Grace was barely conscious when she felt gentle hands lifting her, when she heard a familiar voice whispering words of comfort and love. Through her pain and medication, she recognized the man who had watched over her from afar for so many years, her father, the most powerful businessman in Nigeria, who had been waiting patiently for the day she would need him. "My precious daughter," Chief Adebayo whispered as he held her in the back of his car, driving toward the private hospital he owned. "You've suffered enough. No one will ever hurt you again." For the first time since she was 16 years old, Grace allowed herself to be vulnerable, to accept help, to admit that she couldn't handle everything alone. As she recovered in her father's private medical facility, surrounded by the best doctors money could buy, Chief Adebayo revealed the full scope of his love and his power. Royal Crown Industries wasn't just successful, it was one of the most influential corporations in West Africa. Chief Adebayo owned construction companies, telecommunications networks, oil refineries, and real estate developments across 3 countries. He employed over 50,000 people and had business relationships with government officials, international corporations, and financial institutions worldwide. "Grace," he said as she sat in his study for the first time in 12 years, looking around at awards, photographs with presidents and prime ministers, and evidence of a business empire that stretched across continents. "I've been grooming you to inherit all of this since the day you were born. Not because you're my child, but because you have the intelligence, the integrity, and the strength to handle this kind of responsibility." He explained that he had been monitoring her life not just out of parental concern, but out of business interest. Her years of working humble jobs had given her insights into human nature and social dynamics that couldn't be taught in business school. Her ability to remain kind and genuine despite facing hardship had shown him that she had the character necessary to wield power responsibly. "But I'm just a cleaner," Grace protested, still struggling to see herself as anything more than the humble woman she had been. Chief Adebayo smiled. "You're a cleaner who noticed inefficiencies in corporate operations that million-dollar consultants missed. You're a server who remembered the personal preferences of every customer and increased the cafe's return business by 30%. You're a woman who maintained her dignity and compassion despite being married to someone who didn't deserve you." Over the following 6 months, Grace underwent the most comprehensive transformation imaginable. It wasn't just about changing her appearance, though the world's best stylists, personal trainers, and image consultants certainly helped with that. The real transformation was internal, as Grace learned to see herself as the powerful woman she had always been but never recognized. She studied with professors from Harvard, Oxford, and Lagos Business School, absorbing years of business education in months. She learned corporate law, international finance, strategic planning, and negotiation tactics. She studied art, literature, music, and philosophy, not to seem sophisticated, but to develop the well-rounded perspective necessary for ethical leadership. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to value herself. Through therapy, meditation, and countless conversations with her father, Grace began to understand that David's treatment of her had nothing to do with her worth as a person and everything to do with his own weaknesses and the manipulation he had been subjected to. "Grace," her therapist explained, "people who truly love you don't make you feel small. They don't require you to change who you are to earn their affection. The fact that David's love was conditional and withdrawn when you became inconvenient tells you everything you need to know about the quality of his character, not yours." As Grace grew stronger and more confident, Chief Adebayo began implementing his plan for justice. He didn't just want to destroy the Okafor family financially, he wanted them to understand exactly why they were being destroyed and by whom. The campaign began subtly. Royal Crown Industries quietly withdrew from several joint ventures with Okafor Holdings, citing strategic realignment. Then, major suppliers who had worked with the Okafors for years began declining to renew contracts, explaining that they had better opportunities elsewhere. Government contracts that the Okafors had been virtually guaranteed were suddenly awarded to competitors. David watched in growing panic as his family's business empire began to crumble around him. Contracts worth millions of naira evaporated overnight. Long-term partnerships ended without explanation. Bank loans that had always been rubber-stamped were suddenly denied for risk assessment reasons. What's happening? David demanded during increasingly frantic family meetings. It's like someone is systematically destroying us. Mrs. Okafor, despite her usual confidence, was beginning to show cracks in her composure. It has to be competitors, she insisted. Someone is trying to force us out of the market. Blessing, meanwhile, was discovering that her own family's business connections was similarly evaporating. The web of influence she had relied on to maintain her position in Lagos society was dissolving, leaving her increasingly desperate and dangerous. None of them suspected that the humble woman they had discarded so cruelly was the architect of their destruction, operating from the boardroom of Nigeria's most powerful corporation. The annual Lagos Business Summit was always the highlight of the social and business calendar, bringing together the most influential people in West Africa for 3 days of networking, deal-making, and social posturing. This year's event was particularly anticipated because Chief Samuel Adebayo had announced that he would finally introduce his mysterious heir to the public. For years, speculation had swirled about the identity of the person who would inherit Royal Crown Industries. Chief Adebayo had never married publicly, had no acknowledged children, and had been remarkably secretive about his succession plans. Business magazines had published countless articles speculating about potential candidates, distant relatives, business partners, even government officials who might be positioned to take over the empire. The Okafor family attended the summit despite their declining fortunes, partly to maintain appearances and partly in the desperate hope of networking their way out of their current crisis. David arrived with Blessing on his arm, both of them dressed in expensive clothes that they could no longer afford, playing the part of successful business people even as their world crumbled around them. Mrs. Okafor held her head high as she worked the room, chatting with other society matrons and pretending that her family's financial problems were just temporary setbacks. But those who knew how to read the signs could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she lingered too long in conversations with potential investors, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. To be continued. If this story inspired you to value yourself more, smash that like button, subscribe for more incredible stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear Grace's powerful message. Your support means the world to me, and together we can spread these important messages about self-worth and true love. See you in the next episode.